Hello students, Mr. John here with Chapter 21, Lesson 1. It's called Railroads Lead the Way. I know what you're thinking. Mr. John, we've already learned a whole bunch about the railroad and trains. What else is there to know? The trains, they carry people, they carry goods, they run on steam power, they go choo-choo, and that's what we know. We know plenty. Well, there is a lot of fascinating history behind the men that basically built the railways. There were fierce competitions between basically your railroad barons, who were your bigwigs in the train industry, competing for business. And the history of trains is somewhat fascinating, how it went from a whole bunch of little different companies to just a few big guys owning the show. So that's what we're going to learn today. We'll learn a little bit about train technology and how fierce the business was. Not at all like Thomas and his friends on Soder Island. What do you know about Thomas and friends? I have a little boy, and I read Thomas books quite often. Alright, hey, the railroad business started off slow, but remember learning about the initial locomotives being steam-powered, not very fast, not very efficient, and exploding. Not good, but by the mid-1800s, we remember learning that the railroads basically became a viable source of transportation and began to take off. In the last half of the 1800s, you really had a boom in the railroad industry. By the 1860s, there were 30,000 miles of track laid in the United States, which is pretty much as the rest of the world combined. Between the years of 1870 and 1916, U.S. workers were laying 11 miles of track each and every day. Now, in addition to more track being laid, train companies were consolidating or combining, mostly in the form of larger train companies buying out smaller train companies. So the little guys kept getting bought up by the big guys, and this actually created more efficiency, meaning it took less effort, time, and money to move goods from point A to point B, which means cheaper prices. It's not a totally bad thing. Now, what ended up happening as a result of this consolidation was you ended up with very few railroad companies in charge of pretty much all the railroad in the country. So instead of multiple small owners, you ended up with a few very large owners. You think of consolidation as a vocab word. An example that I give is if I were to consolidate, say, my baseball card collection. That means I go throughout my house and I collect all my baseball cards from everywhere and I pull them together. That's consolidation. So that's what was happening with the rail lines. They were consolidating, coming together. Now, the men in charge of these vast railroad companies that were consolidating were known as railroad barons. Examples would be Cornelius Vanderbilt, ended up owning all the rail from New York City, stretching all the way to the Great Lakes. James J. Hill built a line that ran from Minnesota to Washington. And all this competition between these men was very fierce and occurred in an age of very little government regulation. So they they were cutthroat. They did whatever they had to do to win. Now, in terms of economic growth, trains moved raw materials to factories, and then those raw materials were turned into goods, and then those goods would be shipped back on trains, basically carrying these finished products throughout the country. They, of course, helped people travel faster. These are all good things for the economy. All the rail required spurred the growth of the iron and then the steel industry. The first train lines were made of iron, and then they ended up being made of steel. That meant there was a giant boom to the iron industry and then the steel industry. You also need timber. Timber is the railroad ties, so you ended up having a boost to the timber industry as well as the coal industry because trains run on coal. There was also the train industry itself, which hired thousands of people. So trains were economically good for a lot of people, particularly the railroad barons, but other people got work too. Let's move on to the national rail system. So the first rail lines were pretty hodgepodge. As I mentioned, there were a lot of very small companies, and they all had different gauges. Gauges are the width of the track. So the distance between the track. Why were the gauges different? That's because they wanted their trains to run their track and not other people's trains. So you ended up having this sort of quilt, this patchwork of different trains with different size gauges, and that was bad because that meant that if you wanted to ship your goods long distances, it had to go from this train and then it would be offloaded and put on a new train because the old train couldn't run on this track because it's a different gauge. And so as the train companies were consolidated and purchased by the major players, they began to standardize the train gauge. The standard gauge of train track became 4 feet 8.5 inches. This was so any train could run on any line, and this made things more efficient. It was good. I remember reading about in the South they had a gauge, and in the North they had a gauge, and they ended up switching everything to the North gauge. That meant at one point railroad workers had to go to all the line in the South and move it over like a foot to make it wider, to make it a larger gauge. But pain in the butt, certainly. But did it make things more efficient? Indeed it did. Now there were some other big developments that improved trains as time went on. For example, Eli Janney invented couplers to link train cars together. So like when you play with a little model train and you hook the little cars together, those are couplers. So he created new and improved couplers to make it easier for the workers. Gustavus Swift invented the refrigerated rail car, enabling meat and crops to be shipped further. Always a good thing. George Pullman invented the Pullman sleeping car that had seats that turned into beds. It was like a luxury train car where you could sleep. Sounds wonderful. If you've ever had to sleep in a car on a long road trip, something that's fairly common, you know it would be way better to have a bed in there. Alright, on to the competition. Railroads competed to keep existing customers and to keep their old ones. To their biggest customers, railroad companies often offered secret rebates. A rebate, much like it is now, is essentially a discount. So they basically gave discounts to their biggest customers, and the small rail companies could not afford to offer rebates, so they basically were outcompeted. They were run out of business. However, giving rebates to the big companies made the little guys, like the farmers, have to pay more. Another shadeball trick played by the railroad barons were called pools. Basically, competitors would get together and they'd divide the business up in a sector, and they'd say, all right, you take here, I'll take here, you take here, and here's what price we're going to charge. So they would set the price in an area and divide the business so they all made the most money. Normally, when you don't do that, you have competition. So let's say the Yonda line is in competition with the Edsel line. That means I can't make my prices too high because they'll use the Edsel line instead. But what if I have a secret meeting with Edsel and say, all right, I have an idea how we can both make the most money. I'll take this side of the state, you take that side of the state, and we're all going to charge this price, and that way we're not competing and trying to out-discount each other. And that's what they did, sort of like a monopoly, if you will. Now those types of things are illegal. I remember when flat-screen TVs first came out. It was 10 years ago. They found out that the flat-screen companies were colluding like that, and they got in big trouble because they were setting minimum prices instead of competing with each other. Some laws were created back then to try to stop this kind of tomfoolery, this shady shenanigans, if you will, but they did little to stop the railroad barons. That's most of the lesson. There's like a final paragraph that basically says what the rest of the lesson's been saying. Railroads changed America. Newsflash, it made it easier for people and goods to move about the country. And that's basically it. Now, the next page is an assignment. It's a question. You will write your answer using complete sentences. If you need any help with these questions, please let me know. But I think we pretty much covered everything here in the lesson. It might behoove you to take a look in the textbook as well if you would like some additional information. I mostly went over it, but some of it there's a little more detail in the book, which is usually the case with the Mr. Young lesson. Alright, that's it. If you need me, please contact me. Otherwise, have a good day, alright? Choo-choo.